Well, I'd like to begin by apologizing to three of the panelists. Stephen Crow sent me his paper last week, so I had a chance to read it in some detail. And I only saw Hunt Tooley's paper yesterday, and the other two papers I just glanced at, so I have to apologize to three of the people. I haven't really had time to study your papers very much in detail. Now, on Stephen Crow's paper, I thought it was an excellent paper, but the basic difference I have with him is that he gives what I consider an excellent argument for anarchism. He said, well, people in a state of nature could establish certain rules of governance among themselves, and this wouldn't require having one person or one group as sort of sovereign ruling over them. Now, as a follower of Murray Rothbard, I of course find this a very good argument, but I don't see at all that this is a Hobbesian anarchism. Now, he said it fulfills his three conditions, but his third condition was something like you have a sovereign as a man or a group of men, and it isn't if you have an anarchist system. It's just a system of governance. Now, if you want to say, well, something would fulfill the conditions of what it would do what Hobbes wants much better than the idea Hobbes has, that's fine, but then you're not giving a Hobbesian solution. You're rejecting what Hobbes is doing. So I don't see in what sense this is a Hobbesian anarchism. It's taking Hobbes' starting point and saying that Hobbes was wrong about things. Now, on the criticisms of Levin, I'm not sure the 2 points were right. Now, the first of his criticism was, well, if people surrendered their swords to the sovereign, then this doesn't change human nature. People would still want to fight, have a propensity to fight each other, just as they had this state of nature. They wouldn't have changed their nature. Now, that's certainly right, but I don't think Levin is assuming the contrary. It's not that he thinks people would all be converted into pacifists. It's just that he's thinking that in the state of nature, there would be somewhat of an arms race. You want to have a sword because the other person has one, and then if he has a better sword, you'd want to have more of that. So you could kind of avoid this arms race by giving all your weapons to the sovereign. Of course, you get into the difficulty, well, then we're all having to rely on the sovereign, the person with all the swords. Doesn't seem like a very good deal. And then on the second criticism was that, well, if you did that, in what sense would the state be minimal? Then the state would be, this sovereign would be having an enormous amount of power. Well, I think that's certainly right, but I think what Levin means by minimal would just be minimal functions, not minimal power, but it would just be not having other functions. Of course, you'd have a problem how you could stop the sovereign from doing other things, but I think that's what he means by minimal. Now, turning to Hunt Tooley's paper, as I said, I didn't have a chance to study this. I just saw it yesterday. The only suggestion I'd have for him is there was a very good book, interesting book that came out, I think, around 1921 by Nestor Webster called The French Revolution, a Study of Democracy, that has a very much detailed study of Philippe Egalité's role in the early stages of the French Revolution. She stresses that very much. She, of course, was very controversial because of some of her later works on conspiracy theories. But, she was when she stuck to French Revolution, she was quite good. In fact, in A.J.P. Taylor, a great British historian, in a review of her 2-volume book, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, said in Manchester Guardian around 1937 this was one of the outstanding books on French history. So I think I would suggest that book, The French Revolution, Studying Democracy, is worth adding to. Now, the only criticism I had of his paper is one, sadly for me, he rectified in the later part of his paper. In the first part, he referred to Louis Philippe as King of France, and it's correctly, as he had later correctly, it's King of the French, not King of France. It's very important because he was indicating that his power came from the people, just like Napoleon was crowned French emperor, not emperor of France. So unlike Louis XVIII and Charles X, Louis Philippe was, as Hunt said, a citizen king. I want to turn now to the paper by Colin Pierce, which again an excellent paper, but it sounds like, I'd want to study this in detail, it sounds like this is the one of the papers I'd have the most to disagree with. Now what Professor Pierce is indicating, he said, well, Rothbard was criticizing modern philosophy, particularly saying that Hume's is ought dichotomy, saying this is a mistake, but that in fact the real dichotomy between classical and modern philosophy came about with Hobbes, and that the reason this gets Rothbard into trouble, it's not just that he's made a mistake in saying, well, we have, he's talking about Hume as the division when he should have said Hobbes, but this really strikes at the heart of his system. It isn't just a historical mistake, because Rothbard is relying in his views on natural rights on Locke, and Locke has really taken over Hobbes's view, sort of a passionate view that says that there isn't really a classical reason, but they're sort of reducing reason to the passions. And I think a problem with this view, it depends very much on the interpretation that Strauss in Natural Right and History gives of Locke, where he thinks Locke is really somewhat of a Hobbesian, but he's just trying to conceal this, that according to the way Strauss views things, Locke is someone who is kind of a hedonist. He just reduces morality to self-interest, and he doesn't really recognize an objective morality. Now, I tend to think this interpretation of Locke is quite questionable. I mean, that Locke talks about does think there's a natural law ethics in a pretty standard sense. I don't think that he's making this up. And I find some of the arguments that Strauss and various Straussians have given in support of that reading of Locke are wrong, in my opinion. For example, Strauss says, and other Straussians like Michael Zuckert have said, well, according to Locke, natural law would depend on proving that, on thinking that the soul is immortal, but Locke admits he has no proof for that. But I don't find that argument convincing. I mean, you could just take that as an argument. That's what his argument is, that the soul is immortal, that morality depends on it, somewhat of like an argument that Kant gives in the Critique of Practical Reason, you see. So, I mean, I don't find that at all a convincing line of attack. I don't think it's been shown that Locke is just reduces morality to the passions in the way that Strauss and his followers have suggested. One could also raise criticism, well, is this a correct interpretation of Hobbes? I think here probably the Straussian argument is stronger, but still there are arguments to the contrary. For example, as you find in Howard Warrender book on Hobbes, or Francis Hood, Divine Politics of Hobbes, take a very different view of Hobbes. So I think that somewhat questionable view of Hobbes, and much more questionable view of Locke. So I don't think it's right that Rothbard would get into trouble because it's taking over a Lockean view of rights. He's sort of reducing morality to the passion. I think what's actually involved here is Strauss was very much influenced in his views by the British socialist R.H. Tawney, who was his great friend when he was in England in the 1930s. So he was taken over essentially certain anti-capitalist assumptions that Tawney had about the development of the modern world. And I think you find this there's been a decline of virtue from the medieval and ancient world to the modern acquisitive world. This is exactly the view of Tawney, his famous book, The Acquisitive Society, and the English title is Sickness of the Acquisitive Society. So I think Strauss really took that over from Tawney, and it's, in my view, a very questionable view. Now, on the separation of personal morality from political philosophy, I think the thing for Rothbard is key, that he has a very restricted conception of what political philosophy is, just when is it justifiable to use force. So he isn't saying that you couldn't have, say people like torture, two people wanting to torture, we couldn't have social disapproval of this, but he asked the question, when would it be legitimate to use force to suppress agreements among people? And I think if one said, well, one just to return to the classical view, I think the inequality of the classical view, I think a difficulty in that view is it would be very difficult to come up with a good argument against slavery if you accepted this classical view. And then just one minor point, I think Professor Pierce said that something that Strauss had really refuted Carl Schmitt's conception of Hobbes before. But I mean, Schmitt's book on Hobbes really came out, although of course he talked about Hobbes before. His book on Schmitt, Leviathan, the State's Theory of Thomas Hobbes, came out in around 37 or 38, and that was after Hobbes' famous review of Schmitt in 32, I think. So, I mean, it wasn't that Strauss had refuted Schmitt on Hobbes in a way that Schmitt hadn't responded to. Schmitt came on, real stuff on Hobbes was later, not before. Now, the last paper by Mr. Beelan, I thought was I find myself in I thought it was an excellent paper. I agreed with most of it, but I find myself a little bit in the uncomfortable position of having to defend Hegel. Now, the title of his paper was something like, "Is History Going Anywhere?" But what Hegel seems to be saying is he's not predicting that history is going somewhere. He's trying to sum up where history has come to now. You know, he says in the preface of the Philosophy of Right, you know, that the famous passage where he says the owl of Minerva takes flight only with the coming of dusk, meaning that philosophy will start talking only after events have happened. It's an interpretation of the past, not an attempt to predict what's going to happen. And there was one point in the paper, again, I'd want to study the written paper, but it seemed questionable. Mr. Beelan seems to be suggesting that ideas or logic applies only to other ideas, not to the real world. Well, I mean, supposing that's only if you had a view that everything is composed of ideas, would you have could you say that reason would apply to the real world? Well, I mean, supposing you take just the simple syllogism, all men are mortal, Socrates is man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Well, that seems to me quite a valid conclusion about Socrates, the real person who existed who in the past, not an idea of Socrates. It's actually, using reason, we're talking about the real person. So I don't see any I'm not seeing why one would have to have some sort of odd view of metaphysics to think that logic applies to the world. But again, I want to study these papers in much more detail, so don't take my comments very seriously. I certainly won't.